Well, good morning, everybody. How are we doing? Can you hear me? Am I on? Well, I got a green light. Janina, am I turned up? Can you hear me now? Okay, good. So it's her fault, not mine. All right. Well, today we're going to begin a study on covenants. And it should be an interesting study. Let's go ahead and start out with a prayer. So if you would, let's all bow. Father, we thank you so much for this day, and we thank you so much for everything that you do for us and for this time that we have to study your word. And Father, we just ask that you'd open our hearts and minds and fill us with your word. Father, we thank you so much for your Son who died for us. We thank you for the way that you love us. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. So I want to start off, I want to share a little story about how this came about. It was, I can't tell you how long ago this was, but a long time ago. Well, Janine and I were young. That'll give you some context. Anyway, a long time ago, we got to go to the Red River family encampment. And it was awesome. You know, there was wonderful classes and just awesome singing. And I know we went more than once, but I know one of those years we were there were 3,000 people under a tent all singing a cappella. Now, you hadn't experienced it till you've done something like that. And there were all these good groups and everything. The McCoy family singers were there. Colt's dad and his family. And I can't remember everybody that was there, but it was really, really good. And we just thoroughly enjoyed it. Well, there was another year, and we'd gone up there. Janine's parents took their motor home, and we just followed them in our car, and that way we had a good place to stay, and we had a car to run around in. And then there was another year that they were wanting to go, and I was self-employed then, and sometimes it was really hard for me to get loose, So I ended up staying home, and they went up, and when she came back, she's all excited about this class that she went to. And she tells me it's about covenants. And I thought, well, okay. So at this point, my vast knowledge of covenants was, I know a covenant's an agreement, usually between two people. And I had read in the Bible where, God made covenant with Israel and that kind of thing. And that was about all I knew. So I was less than excited when she told me she had all the... She bought the book and the tapes and the video cassettes. That tells you how long ago it was. And so eventually I started reading the book and watching some of this stuff. And I found out it was very, very interesting. And so then she encouraged me to teach this in a class we used to have across the street back then. And anyway, as I went on, I found out that covenants are quite interesting. And there's a lot more to them than you would think. I don't know if any of you have ever had a study on covenants, but I never had, and I never have since then, and there's really a lot to it. And so I hope you find this interesting. And so anyway, this book's written by David Lusk, and he was the guy that was actually teaching, at Red River Family Encampment where she saw him. And he's quite an interesting guy. He's been a preacher for many, many years in Texas and Arizona and maybe a few other places. And anyway, a while back they wanted me to teach this in the class upstairs, and we go to look for my material and we can't find it. We don't know where it went. It's just gone. So she got a hold of Jerry Lawless, who is the director of the Red River Family Encampment, and he got us in touch with David Lusk, and she got David to send us a book, and we've upgraded. We have DVDs now, so... Anyway, she got all that sent so we could do this. Anyway, in the book, David starts out, he tells about this friend of his, how this came about for him. He tells about this friend of his. They're having a good biblical discussion, and at one point, David said, I mentioned covenant. And as we went on into it, I realized I didn't really know what I was talking about. And so he said, we started studying on covenant. And he said, the interesting thing is, he didn't think there'd be that much to it, but he said a year and a month later, they were still studying on covenant, and they met regularly. And so he said there's a lot more to it than what he thought. And he also, in that part, he also tells about, how important covenant is to our understanding of the Bible, because the Bible is written in covenantal language. And so it's very helpful if we understand some things about covenant when we study in the Bible. He had some scholars as he studied. There were a number of scholars that he had looked up and used some of their material and everything. And he was amazed at what some of them said about covenant. And so I want to read to you just a few of these comments that some of these biblical scholars made about covenant. Edward J. Young said, "Never believe you have understood anything about a Bible until you reduce it to a corollary of covenant." David Alexander, "It can be said that the entire religion of Israel presupposes for its basis a covenant between God and the nation he has chosen." And Mont Smith said, "One must be very careful to read the Bible as he would a treaty document, not as a tool for divination or as a document that carries some magical power to reveal privately some message from God. It is a treaty paper, and it is straightforward in language." And the last one, Robert Brinsmead, says, "This idea of a covenantal relationship between God and man is so basic and overwhelmingly predominant in the Scriptures that the two great sections of the Bible have appropriately been named Old Testament and New Testament, or Old and New Covenant. The covenant theme is not just one of many interesting Bible doctrines. It is part of the very framework of biblical theology, whereas the study of some things in the Bible may be regarded optional as far as understanding its essential message is concerned. Some understanding and appreciation of the covenants is indispensable to the sound knowledge of the Scriptures." And so you see, these scholars feel like an understanding of covenant is extremely important to fully understand the Bible. And I know as I went through it, there were times where it was like, oh, I see why they did this, or hey, that kind of clears things up. And so it's very interesting. Now, the first part of this, we have to look at, what a covenant is and how it works and all that kind of thing. And this isn't the most fun part of the lesson, but we need that background to understand the rest of it. And it gets more and more interesting as we go along. And also, I don't mind standing up here and talking, but I love a class where people give a little feedback, comments, questions, whatever, so y'all feel free to do that as we go along. So God has always dealt with people through covenants. And we'll talk about some of these covenants, but all the way back, if I remember right, there's a covenant with Adam and one with Noah, and then the big covenant for the Old Testament with Moses and so on. And there's many, many little covenants throughout the Bible, and sometimes you don't even realize they're talking about a covenant if you don't understand covenantal language. So it's very helpful. He said, basically, to fully understand the Bible, we need to understand covenants. So we're going to start out defining covenant. And like I said, kind of my vast knowledge on it before was something like this. He says, what does he call? Oh, the Webster definition basically would be a contract or agreement between two, in that each agrees to do something of benefit to the other, or an agreement between two or more persons to do or refrain from doing some act, a compact or arrangement between two parties. But he said the biblical definition will encompass a whole lot more than that. Most covenants started, way back. It's not just in the Bible. Pagans had covenants, and most of their covenants were blood covenants. And biggest part of the covenants in the Bible are blood covenants. Anyway, the pagans used to make agreements by cutting their skin and bleeding, and sometimes even drinking one another's blood. And so that was kind of how a lot of covenants started. Later, as we read in the Bible, covenants were done by killing animals and using their blood. But either way, most of the covenants are blood covenants. Later on in the study, we'll look at a few covenants that are not blood covenants. So the author says that, and I will mention David or the author a lot through this. So anyway, when I say David or the author, you'll know who I'm talking about. He says that the best definition he ever found for a biblical covenant is that from a man named O. Palmer Robertson, and he said the term covenant means a bond in blood sovereignly administered. So that was his best one. And he says that most covenants were formed by touching blood, at least. Like I say, the pagans and them, sometimes they drank blood, but you at least needed to touch blood to ratify a covenant. Excuse me. So he says that blood, blood's kind of something that ties all those covenants together. And a blood covenant is a very strong covenant. So next we're going to look at 3 stories. Now each of these stories helps us understand 3 different kind of covenants. And these are 3 big covenants in the Bible. There are others, but these are the 3 main ones we're going to look at right now. And so I'm going to read each of these stories to you, and these are straight from the author. I'll read each of these 3 stories to you, and then we will put each one of the stories together with one of these covenants that we're going to talk about. So the first story, it says, on November 11th, 1918, the Germans and the Allied forces signed what is known as an armistice agreement to end World War I. You might be interested in knowing that an armistice is a temporary cessation of war based on the input of both sides. Neither of the 2 warring factions really won. They were just weary. They sat down and negotiated a settlement that said, I will stop if you will. By mutual agreement, the opposing forces laid down their arms and went home. All was quiet on the Western Front. So remember this story. It's going to illustrate the first kind of covenant that we'll look at here in a few minutes. So here's story number 2. Some 20 years after the First World War, it all broke out again. Most of the same countries were allied on each side, though this time the Axis forces included the unlikely partnership with Japan. Germany and the European forces finally were defeated, and then all of the Allied might was trained on Japan. On August 6, 1945, a bomber called the Enola Gay was dispatched to drop the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. After 2 bombs were dropped, the nation was brought to its knees. The Japanese asked for peace. On September 9, 1945, in Tokyo Bay, the warring sides met to sign a peace treaty, but this was no armistice agreement. This was a pact of unconditional surrender dictated by the Allies and signed by the humbled nation of Japan. This is the second kind of covenant we'll come back to. And the third story is a personal story from the author. He said, one night when we lived in Texas, I received a phone call from a friend of mine who lives in Arizona. We chatted for a while, and then he asked if my wife and I had ever gone to the Grand Canyon. I answered no. He said, well, come go with me and my wife. I explained that I was poor and didn't have the money, but that didn't put him off a bit. He replied, I know you're a poor preacher. I've heard you preach before. It was a few minutes before I could get him to stop laughing and get serious. Anyway, he continued, my wife and I have decided we were going to pay your way on this vacation. And he was true to his word. Wayne and his wife met us at the airport, and we rode in a van they had rented. We ate meals and munchies they paid for. We played golf on courses my friend reserved. We went to see the sites that they had planned, and we enjoyed a wonderful time at no expense to Donna and me. So with these 3 stories, we're going to look at several different kinds of covenants. Now the first one is a parody covenant. So you remember the first story with the treaty. Both sides decided, okay, we're done. We've had enough of this war and we're done. And so that was the armistice agreement. A parody covenant is an agreement between equals. 2 different people agree on everything. Both sides have a say, and both sides get at least part of their way. So the Bible talks about covenants like that, and we'll look at a few of those a little later. A good example, he kind of gave an example like this in the book, of someone selling someone a car. So like let's say I'm gonna sell Will my car, and I say, Will, I've got this car. I know you're looking for one, and I'm gonna sell this car to you, and I'm gonna let you have it for $15,000. And Will, he goes and looks at the car and says, man, that thing's kind of scratched up, and the driver's seat's a little worn, and a few other things, and I just don't think it's worth $10,000. In fact, I wouldn't give more than, I don't think it's worth that. I wouldn't give more than $10,000 for it. So yeah, I think it's worth $15,000, Will, but he said, no, I don't think it is. And so we go back and forth, and I tell him it's okay, this stuff will polish out, and the seat's not that bad. And so we agree for $12,000. I'm gonna sell him this car. So see, both of us got part of what we wanted. I sold the car, and Will got a car, and I got a little less money than what I wanted, and he paid a little more than what he wanted. But we came to an agreement. And so that would be a good example of a parody covenant. So the next one we're going to look at is a lot different. It's called a Suzerainty Covenant. Now this is between a superior party and an inferior party. And the suzerain is the superior party, and the inferior party was called a vassal. And so in this one, it's quite a bit different. And it's like the second story where Japan, it was an unconditional surrender, and Japan had no choice in the terms. They could take it or not take it. If they didn't take it, they were probably going to get wiped out. So they took it, but they didn't have any. Like I say, they didn't have any say in what happened or anything. And so basically, on a suzerainty covenant, the suzerain dictates the terms, and the vassal can agree or not agree, but he, no matter what, he doesn't have any say in the terms. The suzerain basically, dictates all the terms. Now, the suzerain may dictate to the vassal that he has things he has to do. The suzerain may say, I will do this if you will do this. And so this differs a lot in the first one we looked at, because both sides could work it all out. But in this one, the superior party, he dictates all terms. And so, and we find that God makes these kind of covenants in the Bible. Basically, the Ten Commandments that's a covenant. And later we're going to look at all the parts of some of these covenants. But so in the Ten Commandments, God dictated all the terms, and people could take it or leave it. They had no say. All the terms of the covenant were the Ten Commandments, and so they can accept what God offers or not, but they didn't have any say in any of the terms. And then the third one we're going to look at is this one is God's favorite. He really likes this one. If you think about it, the parody agreement, where two sides both have a choice in what's said and what's done and everything, that's made between two equals. Suzerainty covenant is a superior and inferior party. But the first one, it was between two equals. Well, so the parity agreement, God doesn't do those, because there's nobody equal to God. He doesn't have an equal to make it with. So he either does the suzerainty or the charter agreement, this one. So this one was the story about the friend who took him and his wife on vacation, and they paid for everything, and they took them everywhere. And so David and his wife didn't have to do anything but go and enjoy it. They had no part in what we were going to do, and they have no part in anything else. They're just going to go and enjoy it. And so that's how this charter agreement works. And this can go, I'm going to tell you all these names because sometimes he uses different names in here for it. The charter agreement can also be called a patron covenant, a charter covenant, a unilateral covenant, which that one, I like that one because that tells you it's one-sided. Unilateral is a one-sided agreement. And then it's also called a covenant of grant, because one member of the covenant grants something to the other member. So, like I say, this one is just one person Earlier I said that all I knew about a covenant was that it's agreement between two parties. Well, not always. This one is just one person making this agreement ultimately, and we're going to look at one here in just a few minutes. So this takes the form of a sovereign promise that's voluntarily taken by this one party. And when God makes a covenant like this, there's no human response is needed to it. Like he made the covenant with Abraham, and he's just going to bless Abraham's descendants. Abraham didn't have to do anything for it. And that's what we're going to look at. In fact, if you would, turn to Genesis 15. And, we'll see here when God makes this covenant with and it's Abram at this time, when he makes this covenant that Abram doesn't really have to do anything other than trust God to take this covenant. So we're going to start reading in Genesis 15, first verse. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram, I am your shield, your very great reward. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? And the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Then the word of the Lord came to him. This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. He took him outside and said, Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, So shall your offspring be. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. He also said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it. And I want to stop right there. And I want you all to think about why did God tell him, I am the Lord who brought you out of the Ur of Chaldeans? Did Abram not know who he was? If you think about that, that's a little strange because we know that Abram knows who he is. But actually the reason for that is that's actually the preamble to the agreement. One of the very first parts of an agreement. We're going to look at all these parts later. But anyway, that's the preamble, and so part of the preamble in a covenant like this is that the one who's making the covenant says basically who I am to the one he's making the covenant with. So let's continue in verse 8. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? So the Lord said to him, Bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Abram brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Then the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. And that reminds me of an interesting thing, and I don't remember if I have it later, but a lot of these covenants, like when they made some of the big covenants, they would take all kind of animals, big animals, cows, bulls, whatever, and they literally cut them this way, all the way down, and they would lay each side like this and form a path. And so that path would literally get, it could be blood this deep or however, depending on how the land was. And the ones that were making covenant would walk down that path, and that's how they touched the blood. And so anyway, I just thought that was interesting. Let me find my place here. So Abram brought all these, cut them into, we did that. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, Know for certain, and listen to this part, this is actually another part of the covenant, it's called the blessings and curses. The Lord said to him, Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the fourth generation your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. And in verse 17, we're going to see the covenant ratification, which is another part. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, to your descendants, I will give this land from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates. And so that was God, the smoking firepot, passing through the animals that had been laid there. And that's how he ratified the covenant with Abram. And so he alone passed through there. Abram did not. There was no need for Abram to pass through because he wasn't, he was a part of the covenant, but he wasn't the one making the covenant. Only God was making the covenant with him. So basically, and this covenant was freely given to Abram. He didn't have to do anything for it. God just wanted to bless his descendants, and so he got the covenant kind of for free. And that doesn't always happen, but it did in this instance. However, later God demanded circumcision for the rest of Abram's heirs to be a part of this covenant. And it says in Genesis 17:14, any uncircumcised male who has not been circumcised in the flesh will be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. So once God decided this, circumcision became a sign of this covenant. And any male who decided not to be circumcised would not be a part of the covenant. But that's all they had to do. If they were circumcised, then they became a part of the covenant. So in a covenant like this, we could wonder, how would someone break a covenant like this, since it's just basically, yeah, Pat.
So does that change the nature of the covenant? Now that, in other words, before they had to do nothing, and then they have to become circumcised, does that change the nature of the covenant?
I don't think so. I think everything stayed the same, but for some reason he decided to give it directly to Abraham without needing a sign. But then later he wanted a sign, and so then once that happened, just all the descendants of Abraham to be part of the covenant just had to go ahead and be circumcised. So anyway, how would one break a covenant? And basically, like in this one, it would be by refusing the sign of the covenant. And if they chose not to be a part of the covenant, all they would have to do on this particular covenant was not get circumcised. It would be different for different covenants because, each covenant can have a different sign.
Doesn't that change because you have to be circumcised on the 8th day? So you're saying that the parents are the ones that would break the covenant, not the child?
As far as I know.
Is that what you're,
I think so.
Because there's no choice.
Right. Which brings up another question I had never thought of. Let's say the parents didn't do it. I suppose someone, as they grew and wanted to be part of the covenant, could be circumcised, because it simply says they just had to be circumcised and they were part of the covenant. So, hopefully you would hope your parents would take care of that and you'd just automatically be in the covenant. And things were a lot different back then in these times where we're talking, because, now if we're going to be part of our covenant, we're probably going to be here and we're going to know who's this, and we study the Bible and we do all this stuff. Well, back then, they didn't really have Bibles so much, and some of them lived far away, and so it wasn't as obvious, that they were a part of this covenant. And but anyway, it was very important that if they wanted to be part of it, they had to be circumcised. And like I say, other covenants have totally different. Every covenant can have a different sign, and so, but most of them would have a sign that you could not take part in or something like that if for some reason you didn't want to be a part of it. And the the lesser party can also just refuse the covenant. If it's with God, that's probably not a smart thing to do, but he can. And so, anyway, he gave an example. Yeah, go ahead.
Will post a question there. What if the parents neglected having it done, and as the child grew, could they on their own then?
He didn't say anything about that, but I think so. I think they could because the sign only says that they must be circumcised to be part of it, and so it doesn't. As far as just this covenant, it doesn't say they had to be at that time, and so I think they probably could do it later, but I'm not positive about that.
No indication. There's no example.
Right. Yeah, I didn't find anything like that. So. Anyway, he gives an example in here. How many of you remember the movie The Raiders of the Lost Ark? Do y'all remember that? So do you remember he finds this disc, and he also, and I don't remember it. It's been a long time since I've seen it, but he finds this disc, and he finds that this model of a city down in this underground kind of thing, and eventually. He finds a rod, and he puts the rod in this little spot in the floor, and he puts this disc on it, and when the disc hits when the sun hits that disc, it shines and it points out a specific part of the city. And so it made it clear where the ark was. That's kind of how they found the ark. And David Lusk, he likes to say that, when you study the Bible, you may understand it to a degree, but he said when you study it, understanding covenant, it's like when that sunlight goes through that disc, and it makes it very clear your path, whatever you need to know. It just clears it up, and y'all will see some of this a little later. But I thought that was a pretty neat little analogy he made there. So anyway. And now we want to understand the Bible itself is not a covenant, but it's a record of many covenants. And there are a lot more covenants than you would think in the Bible, because sometimes we don't recognize, not knowing covenant language and all that, we don't really recognize when we're reading about a covenant sometimes. And, like I say, I knew God had made covenant with the Israelites, but I couldn't think of a whole lot of other covenants. I mean, I don't know if y'all know, maybe y'all know more about it than I did, but it's just interesting. You don't really even know what you're reading sometime if you don't know covenant language. And so we're going to look at a few words and things. I didn't put a whole bunch of them in here, but just a few examples. And so in covenant language, righteousness, and we know what righteousness means. It's being right, doing things right. It's being on the right side of everything. Basically, the definition for righteousness means keeping covenant, because the covenant it says what you're supposed to do, and if you do something different than that, you're not righteous. You're not keeping the covenant. Sin is a breach of the covenant or disobedience. So same thing, if you don't follow the terms of the covenant, that's sin. You're not doing the right thing. You're not being righteous. Also, blessings are covenant blessings. There were blessings in these covenants that, some were kind of general for everybody, and some were very specific to the group that the covenant was made. And so, but all of them usually have, especially in the last kind of a covenant, all of them have the covenant blessings in them. Also, people that are in covenant kind of take on a new meaning. The word elect, and I can remember reading the word elect a long time ago and thinking, that's got to be like what, special people or something, right? And that's kind of true. It says elect are those selected to be incorporated into the covenant. And so it's like God chose Israel to be his special people in that covenant. And so they would be the elect. Also children of God, and we're real familiar with that term, but that would be those that have a covenantal relationship with God, are children of God. And this one's interesting, Gentiles. So Gentiles were those outside of the covenant, and they weren't included at all. And it says that some people called them just a heap of people, because since they weren't part of the covenant, they in a way didn't matter, because they're not in covenant with God, And I had always learned that Gentiles were non-Jews. There's Jews and there's Gentiles, and I guess that's true because God made covenant with the Jews, and at first He didn't have any covenant for the Gentiles. Later there was something added to include Gentiles, so they were just a heap of people for a while. Also, relationships take on a new meaning. God's covenant people are very, very special. Like we said, Israel was always God's special possession. And it's just because Israel accepted the covenant. He said Israel has something special. In all of history, only the Jews were said to have a covenant with their God. Leon Morris said that every religion has some form of union, fellowship, friendship, or relationship with their deity. But the Hebrew religion, he says, was unique in that this union, fellowship, and partnership with the deity is based on a legal agreement called a covenant. So if you're in covenant, it makes you very special. Because God only deals with people through covenants. So next we have a story by the author that'll help us look at one part of a covenant. He says, "My wife and I married in her teens. I was 19 and she was 18. To say the least, we were not geniuses in the world of business. One day a salesman showed up at our door and convinced my wife that she really needed some magazines coming to our house. She signed the contract and then told me the good news after I arrived home. After a discussion that you could probably hear 2 blocks away, I convinced her that we really didn't need that wonderful offer. We pulled out the contract and really looked at it for the first time. It was a nightmare that bound us to the magazine people for 3 years at a horrible rate of interest, about 3 times the bank rate. Donna and I learned a lot about contracts that week, how easily one gets into them and how difficult it is to get out. So if you're a smart buyer, you always want to check these things out, before signing anything or any kind of contract. You want to make sure you fully understand the terms and if there's interest and all that kind of thing, and maybe payments or whatever. And anyway, you really want to make sure that you fully understand anything before signing. People have gotten in trouble a lot by signing something they didn't read, and so that's a very important part. And he makes the point also that the Bible student needs to understand various covenants in the Bible, and that way we fully understand what's going on, what's being talked about, and what's happening. And like I keep saying, later on you'll see some of these things that because I can remember reading something and that I really never fully understood, and it does. It clears it up a little bit. So anyway, we're about to get in a part where we're going to look at some more kinds of covenants, and I think we're close enough. I want to go ahead and stop there. And I got to tell you, when I agreed to start this series this week, I didn't realize that I was going to have to be gone next week. But Philip is going to fill in next week, and then the following week we'll get back on the covenants. And so, anyway, I appreciate your attention. Sure.